we begin this final section of chapter 2, we're going to be talking about brain anatomy. And so most of what will be like the vast majority of what we'll be talking about in this class is, well, we cover everything, but a lot of the stuff we'll be talking about is in this forebrain area. The forebrain, right here, this is the telencephalon. This includes all the neocortex, which is basically all the lobes. The neocortex is like all of that cortex space, and we've separated it into lobes. So that includes all of the frontal, temporal, parietal, occipital lobe, and it also includes the basal ganglia, excuse me, the cerebellum, sort of right here. And basically any of, actually, no, excuse me, the cerebellum is down here with the pons and the brainstem, excuse me. I was thinking that as I said it, but the blue color got me for a minute. So this basically includes all of the cortex. It includes basal ganglia, which you'll learn about a little bit more in terms of movement and reward processing, sort of all the olfactory bulb for, again, sort of aspects of smelling, your lateral ventricles, all that sort of space in there is in your forebrain. And then we're shifting down in here to this area to the brainstem, which is most of these places here. You have these, first we have the diencephalon, which we'll be talking of, this is definitely next in emphasis because you have the thalamus, the hypothalamus, pituitary gland, pineal body, third ventricle. All of these up here are really like critical for involved in like hormone release, hormone regulation, and aspects of development, turning on hormones and off at specific times to give rise to the various gendered traits and stuff like that, in terms of look and appearance. And then next within the brainstem, we have the mesencephalon. This includes the tectum, tegmentum, the cerebral aqueduct. And then we had the metacephalon, which is your cerebellum, pons, and fourth ventricle. And then we again have the myelencephalon and the spinal cord, which is the medulla oblongata and fourth ventricle. All right, so looking into these spaces a little bit more. In the telencephalon, again, we have these primary areas that you guys are interested in, that we'll be covering a lot in this class. The frontal lobe, this is involved in decision-making, motivation, attention, higher reasoning, memory recall, and planning aspects of movement, which is primarily this area and here. Sequential planning, so many higher order functions, have a play here in the frontal lobe. The next we have the parietal lobe, and the parietal lobe is the integration of sensory information. And so there's a lot of, attention elements that are also in this space. So integration of sensory information, so sort of some higher level sort of perceptually elements and sort of the way sensory information gets integrated. If there's damage, then information doesn't get integrated correctly, and that can give rise to brain disorders that are really quite unusual in their characteristics of like how you would see the world. One of them is known as neglect, and we'll be covering that more, and basically means sort of when you would neglect one side of space due to some damage in your parietal lobe, because it's basically not able to integrate the sensory information together. Then we have the occipital lobe, which is the visual processing. And so in terms of sensory information, you'll be learning more about this, like the visual information comes up here, the auditory information comes up here. So this is a big, sensory integration hotspot. And then again, our temporal lobe, which is language and visual and auditory perception. And then next, when we're heading into the diencephalon, we have the thalamus. And this is critical for the relay of sensory information. And it includes the lateral geniculate nucleus for the visual system relay, meaning that, like, well, we'll learn about later, but the visual information travels through this lateral geniculate nucleus. And then we have a similar thing for the auditory, which has the medial nucleus, and it's this is where these sort of sensory sort of spots or pathways that information passes through, where there can be sort of preliminary or initial sort of automatic processing. And then we also have the ventral posterior nucleus, which is involved in somatosensory sort of or touch relay. So basically we have these sensory relays for, most of our primary senses: visual, auditory, and relay. And somatosensory. Next, we have the hypothalamus. So this is really critical in hormone regulation and homeostasis. It's also really important in terms of hormone, sort of the distribution of hormones for sex, sort of, or in regards to sexual characteristics, physical characteristics, development, the body, hunger, temperature, water, and sleep. And then it's also very critical for the relay of sensory information. It's in a very key spot in the brain where so many things sort of travel through it. And then we have the pituitary gland right up in here, and that is for hormone regulation and release. And this also includes the optic chiasm, which basically is sort of the tracks of the eye, coming together and crossing. We'll learn more about that in vision. And the mammillary bodies, which connect to the thalamus, and these play a role in memory. Next, we're working our way through here, and we're on the mesencephalon, so which is the green here. And we see that this space, while not sort of the tectum, the tegmentum, the cerebral aqueduct, this basically includes these spaces over here. So this includes the superior colliculus, which is used for eye tracking and visual reflexes, sort of like moving suddenly to the side, squirrel, that kind of thing. And auditory reflexes would be the inferior colliculus. And then we have the periadectual gray. This surrounds the cerebral aqueduct, and it receives information from the amygdala about fear, and it regulates fight or flight responses, and it affects pain perception. So, and then continuing with the rest of the mesencephalon, then we have, and again included in these spaces, is the substantial niagara and the ventral tegmentum. The substantial niagara actually sends tracks to the striatum for smooth muscle movement, and it uses the neurotransmitter dopamine. So we'll get into this space more later on in terms of the role of dopamine in movement. And then we have the ventral tegmentum. This sends projections to the cortex and nucleus accumbens, and it is important for motivation and addiction. So this is the mesencephalon that we're sort of done with this space right here. And next, I'm going to go through these. We don't need, these are each vary in terms of how important they are. But really at this point, it's like becoming familiar with sort of how all these pieces work together and some of the general places of where they are. All right, so for the mesencephalon, we have the cerebellum, pons, and the fourth ventricle. So the pons is really important for sleep, arousal, breathing, eye movements, and facial expressions. And cerebellum actually means little brain, just because of the sort of the intricately wrapped cortex and stuff like that. It's a large structure that's actually inferior or ventral to the occipital lobe, and it's really key for motor control, balance, coordination, learning, and memory. And the cerebellum contains highly specialized sort of branched neurons called Purkinje cells. which we'll probably get to later as well. And then for the Diencephalon, getting down here towards the end, we have the medulla oblongata, which is breathing, heart rate, blood pressure, and vomiting. Let me tell you, if you basically get any sort of stroke within some of these spaces, usually it's pretty much on automatic passing. It's not a good space to have a stroke where your key vital functions are regulated. And then we have the reticular formation, which is arousal, sleep, tension, and respiration, and heart rate. And so that is down here in this space as well. Now, before, so these are basically the structures of the brain. Again, most of the ones that we'll be focusing on are up towards sort of up here in this space more. So thinking about the forebrain and then the Diencephalon. So these are some of the primary areas where we'll be focusing, where you want to focus most of sort of learning in terms of the terms and associations. But you also want to know a fair amount about the cerebellum. So this is the Diencephalon that we were talking about. And some of these, again, like you'll be more familiar with them as they're introduced later in the chapters. So this is really a space to just kind of learn about them a little bit here and come back for reference. And you'll learn about substantia niagara more when we get to movement and some of these spaces probably when we get into addiction. So these mostly will be coming back. And then your cerebellum we'll be talking a lot more about, and then some of these final pieces that are really vital functions. It's really just sort of about knowing that they're there and knowing what sort of happens with some of these spaces. So most of the exam stuff that you're going to want to know is up towards in the forebrain and the Diencephalon. And so with that in regard, at the end of each chapter, I have the key terms that are included, or that you sort of, like there's many more key terms in the textbook, and these key terms are designed for like, this is where you would focus more of your effort in terms of having some knowledge in these spaces. They're all a little bit different in terms of how much you would need to know about them, just a sort of a basic familiarity and sort of like, okay, it's connected to word related to this, or something that you're going to need to know in more detail. So you will need to kind of navigate through that stuff yourself in terms of your studying. But on here is basically the key terms that will give you an idea of how the content is focused a little bit more for the exam. And generally things that are not on this list at all are really not going to be covered. So this is meant to be helpful, but it's not meant to sort of show you exactly like we're focusing on this and this. So all of the chapters will have the sort of end of key terms at the end for the last recorded video. And this is to basically help you sort of direct your learning to more of the focused and need to know content in the chapter. Alrighty, so this is the end of the chapter. Thank you guys very much for being with me through chapter 2, and I'll see you next time for chapter 3. Bye, y'all.